Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. With the patch 11.1 releasing oh so soon, now is that final chance for classes to get tuned up and ready to go before a brand new season. And over the past few weeks we've been talking a lot about hunters, shamans, mages, warriors, but there's also another class that saw a significant bit of buffs week after week over these past few PTR updates, and that is the class of Paladin. As we're seeing Retribution, Protection, and even Holy Paladin seeing a significant amount of changes, I wanted to hop on PTR and actually give these specs a go. To some degree, I'm actually kind of invested into how well Paladins are going to perform going forward in the next season. Protection and Retribution definitely started off very strong, and eventually Holy Paladins found their niche type of gameplay as the hammer-wielding, melee, healing, lightsmith playstyle. And I'm actually kind of excited to see how the class is going to perform heading forward into a brand new season. And I want to take a closer deep dive at some of the recent buffs that each one of the specs of the Paladin class have gotten recently. But as always though, if you guys want to see more regular updates for the patch 11.1, especially when it comes to class changes, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So when taking a look at all the Paladin changes, normally I do it in alphabetical order, starting with Holy Paladin into Protection into Red, but I'm actually going to go the other way around just because Holy has a lot more of granular changes, and I feel like I really need to take a second to talk about the Holy buffs as well as how the specs have been doing. But I do want to start with the most popular one, Retribution. A lot of players play Retribution Paladin in War Within for Season 1, and it's looking like a fairly decent option heading into the next season. Not really changing too much, but I kind of like their tier set. Very RNG heavy with its resets with winning streak, but being able to just spam holy power abilities for 4 seconds as soon as you get the proc, which even has like an audio component to it. Like you actually can hear the tier set procking. You don't just need to see the buff, which a weaker is going to be necessary, I think, for visual. Those of you that are more visual than auditory, but literally being able to hear the tier set has been interesting. But Retribution Paladin are seeing even more buffs heading forward. Not incredibly consequential buffs, but just raw buffs of 5% more damage all across the board, plus the tier set, plus the gear. All of those things are going to help them scale up, but heading forward into Season 2, they're just seeing a slight increase. They also noticed that a lot of players are playing Execution Sentence, but not as many are picking up Final Reckoning. So they ended up increasing the effectiveness of Final Reckoning. One of those is by increasing his damage by 75%. So the actual ability itself, the global, does a significant bit of damage, and it does AoE damage to all targets in the area. So it's probably going to be a very strong pick for AoE content like dungeons. Plus they also changed it so Final Reckoning benefits Templar Hammer of Light ability, so that should be a little bit better of a synergy, especially with its AoE component. So that should be also maybe possibly good. Empyrean Hammer damage, however, did take about a 30% damage loss, but the benefits of Hammer of Light with Final Reckoning, I guess they feel like that's to try to even things out a little bit. But also they notice the Templars getting a little bit more play than Herald of the Sun, so it might be one of those things where trying to tone down the Templar while also trying to buff up Herald of the Sun. With Herald of the Sun, there are changing a few things about it, like Sun's avatar, for example. The damage of this ability is getting buffed up by 50%, so that's going to be significantly more radiant damage to put up against the targets, or I guess supposed to be radiant healing if it hits an ally, but this is mostly for damage side of things for Retribution. Outside of the second Sunrise also saw a buff where Divine Storm and Hammer of Wrath now have a increased chance to be cast again, going up from 15% chance to a 20% chance, which is a slight increase, but is still consequential. The damage component, where both of those abilities can be cast again at 30% effectiveness, has also been amped to 50% effectiveness. So spamming out Divine Storms is a chance you're able to send out another Divine Storm and have the effectiveness, or more Hammer of Wraths for additional damage. So that's pretty solid and should hopefully make Herald of the Sun hopefully a fairly competitive choice, given Paladins 2 options between Templar or Herald, although I haven't seen the actual sims because it's just so early on PTR to see the sims for these playstyles and both of these hero specs, since final tuning hasn't been done, but hopefully they'll find a nice middle ground where both of them have a time to shine in the spotlight. Prop Paladin is a very popular pick for Season 1 content, and they're seeing some buffs but also nerfs. It looks like Vengeance Demon Hunter may potentially be stealing the show away from Protection Paladin, even though it still should look pretty good in Season 2. They are making it notably a little bit weaker. First of all tank specs saw a 15% 5% damage buff or a 20% depending on the spec. For protection, it was a 15% damage buff, so all of your abilities are going to be hitting a little bit harder, mostly to make sure the tanks do not fall behind DPS classes when it comes to holding aggro against the raw damage, but also to make sure the tank damage remains consequential in content like dungeons or raids. Though they did end up nerfing protection in a handful of departments. Like the talent Strengthened Adversary used to give you a 5% parry per enemy struck by Avenger Shield. That's been reduced down to 3%, so slight defensive reductions there. The cooldown reduction from Uther's Council has also been affected. It used to be a 30% cooldown reduction on all of your blessing and major abilities, but that's been reduced down to 15%, so you see that utility as well as some defensiveness impacted significantly. Also, refining fire damage has also been nerfed by 30%, so that's also a little bit of a damage loss for protection. You still have an incredible good array of utility from Blessing of Protection, Spell Warden, being able to bubble taunt a bunch of enemies at the same time. Significant improvements with the Templar playstyle and the damage values that we're seeing at least in dungeon content for Season 2. It looks like there's a lot less tank busters, so Templar may actually have some functionality. You might be able to go a little bit more aggressive with its protection and play less of this defensive lightsmith type of gameplay. We'll see exactly which one of those ends up being better. I guess what I'm trying to say is Protection Paladin is still walking into this patch with a ton of good utility, generally good off healing, generally good damage, but you are going to be a little bit weaker, and it does seem like they might not be completely S tier heading forward, because like I said, it looks like Avenged Demon Hunter is really taking things over as of recently, but protection is still seeing a significant bit of play over on the PTR. It does seem like a very, very viable and a very powerful option, so I guess we'll have to wait and see how the final tuning treats him right before Season 2 is officially released. Though the spec that's seeing the most amount of changes over on the PTR will be the spec of Holy, and there's a significant amount of adjustments that have changed out their playstyle a little bit. What they were trying to do more or less is trying to find ways to bring up the ability for this caster Holy Paladin to shine. Like if you want to play, Paladins have gone through so many different iterations over the last few expansions, whether they were the Glimmer Paladin, with Glimmer being officially removed as of recently. Glimmer Paladin were a thing back in BFA. Then you also had the Ladder the Martyr, and the kind of didn't quite bring exactly the same Ladder Martyr from Shadowlands, but Ladder Martyr Paladins were a thing. For a good bit, we had Avenger Crusader Paladin, which was heavily bolstered by Lightsmith, so you could go this aggressive melee damage to heal allies type of a Paladin. And it looks like they're trying to give him more opportunities and more builds, but I feel like Paladins are always been pulled in so many different directions because the Paladin, Holy Paladin community specifically, everybody just has their own preference of Paladin. Some people like the melee healer Paladin, some people love the Martyr Paladin. The Glimmer build is gone, but that used to be a specific type of a playstyle that players enjoyed. And then there's also the Caster Paladin, which don't really get nearly as much play as I hoped they would. A lot of them end up, I feel like, pressing Holy Shock and using Holy Shock as the primary healing ability, plus Word of Glory, or I guess if you're a Herald of the Sun, Eternal Flame to heal allies. But that full caster type of playstyle that focuses on healing from a distance, I don't think it's just this sees a lot of play as of recently, and it looks like they're trying to bring that up a little bit. We did see some reductions at first though with Commanding Light, where Beacon of Light transfers additional 5% amount healed. It used to be 10%, slightly reduced to 5%. I think mostly because it has an excellent synergy with Beacon of Virtue, which ended up being like a very, very popular pick for a good portion. But also talents like Truth Prevails also saw their healing reduced by roughly 20%. I think mostly because the melee Lightsmith playstyle was very, very strong, and they were trying to see if they can clock it back a little bit for 11.1. I think mostly just to reduce the effectiveness of one build a little bit in order to open up more options for Holy Paladins to be able to spec into other playstyles and other builds. Part of that, things like Holy Prism saw a 20% healing buff increase. The prime ability of Holy Shock also got buffed by 100%, so they tried to buff it up even further. Actually, no. The damage component got buffed up by 100%. I stand corrected. They tried to make it a little bit better for damage, but the healing got buffed up by 40%. So still a significant bit of holy healing increase, but also that damage increase as well. That Dawn healing has also been buffed up by 15%. This ability is always in a weird spot where I feel like a lot of the times Paladin just ends up using Word of Glory or Eternal Flame to just heal allies because it's just more significant, while Latadon just does very minor spread healing, and it just doesn't feel like nearly as punchy and nearly as impactful unless you end up synergizing with other talents that grant you the ability for free, like Empyrean Legacy, for example. And I just feel like I kind of want Light of Dawn maybe at some point to have some raid viability for Paladins to actually have good AoE healing. They try to buff it up, but I feel like it just still keeps playing second fiddle to Word of Glory and Eternal Flame in terms of just the raw impact that it has when you use it. But like I mentioned before, they're trying to make that castered-in Paladin playstyle a little bit better. So things like Holy Light are seeing yet another healing increase by 20%. Slightly more mana cost, but like a very slight mana cost. The ability is already mana hungry, so like a slight mana increase is a very tiny, like 0.5% or 0.4% is really not a lot. So this raw increase to Holy Light healing does end up nerfing Divine Favor a little bit. They nerfed that healing increase from 40% to 20% for the ability, which I think allows you, like if you are trying to play a playstyle where you use Holy Light more aggressively, you're able to get a lot more upfront value out of it. You will still end up using the Divine Favor in order to get yourself a beefier version of the ability every time you Prism or use Barrier of Faith, but even just using the ability outside of those, that's really what they're trying to do, is try to buff up all those casted abilities so they're a little bit better outside of you having to proc things like Infusion of Light, and they've been doing that over the last couple of builds. It hasn't really been enough to allow for a Cassidin to make play, but it's just another change in order to try to make that playstyle just a little bit better. Further tuning saw even more changes, like your Word of Glory healing also goes for your Eternal Flame, buffed up by 15%. Hammer and Anvil, because I guess they thought, oh, okay, well, maybe it looks like people are still playing that melee healer playstyle with things like not tempered in battle. Hammer and Anvil reduced by 33%, so a significant nerf towards your damage healing gameplay. Light of Dawn, I guess at some point they thought, all right, maybe we should buff it some more since we're buffing Word of Glory. 12% buff on top of that. And these are at least a lot of the most recent buffs that we've seen for Paladin over these past few weeks. And I've actually been able to take the combination of these buffs plus a couple of different builds that I've saw people play on the PTR and Mythic Plus to try to give Holy Paladin a go, because I've always enjoyed Holy Paladin from a very specific playstyle. I played it during Dragonflight, where the spec didn't really feel all that great, where it felt like you had to use so many different cooldowns just to put up some decent healing. It felt like you were endlessly spamming Holy Shock, but no matter how many times you did, your healing wasn't bursty. But you felt like you were spending a lot of mana and a lot of cooldowns and a lot of globals just to incrementally increase someone's health little by little. And I felt like I was maybe too bogged down with way too many cooldowns. Blizzard tried to make this spec a little bit burstier, which is what a lot of people like out of Holy Paladin. It feels great when your Holy Shock, your Word of Glory, your big Holy Light with Divine Favor is able just to top somebody off and do a ton of healing all in a single setup. It feels so much more satisfying that way, and they've been really attempting to try to make the playstyle return for 11.1, or at least it feels like they tried to. And while the Cassidin playstyle for Holy Paladin doesn't seem to be the most popular version of Paladin, although a portion of the community still does and would love to be able to play Paladin in that type of way, I did try to make some kind of a build that could potentially play around it, really focusing on the ability for you to create some burst healing capabilities. And at least when it comes to PTR testing, it does seem that the spec has quite a bit of punch to it when it comes to some of your heals. I was able to get Holy Shock to crit a lot more consistently, and when it does crit inside of a major cooldowns, up to 5 and even 6 million crits, which feels very satisfying. To give you an idea, our health numbers are more or less about 10 mil within dungeons with scaled gear or scaled to a certain item level gear numbers, so about 10 million health is what everybody's running with, so being able to heal for 60% of that in a single global feels incredibly good. Eternal Flame is what I played, but I guess you could technically play it with Light Forge instead with Word of Glory. I mean, that healing also can crit for quite a decent bit, but even its non-crit damage can also heal for a decent bit inside of cooldowns. I find myself using a lot of those crit-based heals with the AoE Beacon of Light, with the Beacon of Virtue specifically, and try to see if I can line up some of those massive crits, and I try to see if it can synergize it together with Holy Light, which also could do a lot of healing. It is a very mana expensive ability, but it did feel a lot better to use when you do use it. It's not a button I end up using a lot myself, but when I do use it, I felt like it was a lot more impactful, and that felt great. And I also tried to play Paladin with some of the builds that we saw over on the PTR. And when I did some research initially to try to see what is everybody playing in 11.1 when it comes to Holy Paladin, I noticed there's not a lot of Holy Paladins to begin with, whether it's in logs or whether it is with other builds. Like Raid.io technically shows some PTR builds and people are running, has been one of the great sources for me to find at least some kind of a setup if I'm not maining a spec like Outlaw Rogue, but I still just want to dive into dungeons and see how it performs. I just don't see a lot of people playing Holy Paladin to begin with. But the builds that I saw people play into, they ended up feeling kind of like a bit much too cooldown stacky for my liking. So I don't really know what kind of a build you will end up playing with Holy Paladin, but it feels like potentially the spec could be going back to maybe Dragonflight-y, getting a bunch of cooldowns together in order to try to maintain everybody and mostly spending your time Holy Shocking. But I guess only time will really tell if this is going to be one of those specs that ends up potentially picking up steam. Maybe it'll see some damage tuning and healing tuning going forward to really put it in a better spot, at least for Mythic Plus dungeons. I feel like Holy has enough uniqueness to be brought into raid content just because it's really the only one that can bring in the stronger version of your aura of devotion with the aura mastery. I mean, it's just a very, very strong combination that is likely to secure him a raid spot for a very long time unless they change it or potentially add that buff towards protection or retribution. But I'm just a little worried about how Holy might perform in Mythic Plus dungeons. I'm hoping it'll be in a much, much better spot and hopefully we'll see some favorable tuning, but I guess only time will tell. But I did find myself surprisingly drawn to Holy Paladin, and I'm actually kind of invested in how this spec performs going forward. Technically did see a lot of buffs. I'm just a little bit concerned about not as much representation and very, very little play that we've seen of this spec so far on the PTR. But as always though, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community, probably the best place to reach out to me directly or to discuss with the rest of the community regarding all of these new changes. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.